I'm delighted today that we are joined by Julian Dean, who is the Climate Action Officer for the Green Party of England and Wales. Julian first joined the Green Party back in 2015. He's inspired by some of the principal stands taken by Natalie Bennett and Caroline Lucas during the 2015 general election, and that's the point he got involved. He later got involved in local campaigns to defend NHS services in Shropshire, where he lives, and became a councillor in Shropshire very recently. He also works for the Green Party of England and Wales as our Climate Action Officer, working with local parties, members, and in particular candidates and councillors on measures to take meaningful climate action, such as declarations of climate emergencies, but also the things that follow that up as well. I'm going to hand over now to Julian, and there'll be an opportunity for questions and answers at the end of the session. Please post your questions in the chat. Over to you, Julian.
Thanks, Ed. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to share my screen, but just before I do that, just a little bit about just a tweak on the introductions, Ed. So my job is very much councillor facing, and I think that might be something we want to think about towards the end of the session, because there was supposed to be a sort of a campaign set up within the party, which was going to be a wider thing to support local parties in climate action and getting them going on it. And there was actually a job advertised, but that was all put on hold because of the lockdown. So there is a question around what local parties are doing, and as it happens, what I'm going to go through will touch on the whole issue of working with allies and stuff. And it was really interesting hearing some of the chat that I just picked up towards the end of your lunch break. So what I propose to do is to really whiz through my slides, because there's not a lot. There's 24 of us here, and it would be really good if most of the time is an opportunity for us to exchange some views. So I will share my screen and I will whiz through my slides, and some of this will be familiar to you and some of it might not be, I hope. So okay, somebody put up their hand just to say they can see that. Fantastic. Okay, so a little bit of background for those of you who are where can we go? Background or recap, I suppose. I'm going to drag some things out of the way so I can see what I'm doing. Okay. Oh yeah. So yeah, actually a warm up. So in the chat, I'd just like you to list the key areas for climate action. And I'm talking now, don't write anything yet. I'm talking about the big headings. So I'll give you a clue. One of them is transport. So you should be able to come up with about 5 big headings, and it's just a nice way to warm up and make sure that we're all on the same page and that we all know where action needs to be taken to mitigate against climate change. So if you type that but don't send it, and then on my mark we'll all just enter them, and then hopefully we'll see whether or not we're all on the same page. So I'll give you 1 minute to just type down the 5 key areas for climate action. Somebody's entered one already. And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Do you want to enter them all now? Let's have a look what we've got. Oh, look, lovely. Okay. Energy, land use, transport, heating, circular economy, transport, food consumption, recarbonising. I guess you mean decarbonising, Nicola. Anything else in there? Transport, yeah, housing, food, absolutely. So we're all familiar with this. So to just whiz through. There we go. So this is from a couple of years ago. This is the as you can see, the BEIS Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Department's estimates of emissions. 26% of the UK's emissions were down to transport. 25% down to energy supply, and then a big chunk is down to residential, and as you can see, also a chunk down to agriculture. Now, of course, this story keeps changing, and the big story over the years and the claim to fame for the government, where they sort of try and make noise about how successful they've been, is really about energy supply. So we know that the story around energy supply has been changing quite markedly in terms of the introduction of renewable energy and the gradual reduction in the use of coal, in particular, and to a certain extent gas, but not to the same degree. So that's the big story. I'm not proposing that we, as councillors, we need to dig into that in a huge degree right now, but it just gives us an overview of where the areas are for work. Just to make the point that quite a lot of this stuff is about understanding the different ways in which carbon is used. So you've got the initial, if you think about a building, you've got the initial embodied carbon usage emissions, which come from just putting the building up, and we know that concrete is a particular problem. You've then got operational use from running the building, heating the building, all that sort of thing, and replacement in bodies, which is a surprisingly large proportion in some cases. That can be, especially if you think about sort of an operating business, that can be things like replacing the office furniture and those sorts of things. And so there are things in terms of procurement that can make a big difference there. So it's just worth having those sort of three headings in mind when you're thinking about these different areas. So the Ashton 31, in terms of what local authorities can do, I hope that you have all seen my briefings over the months. And one of the key things that I've been sharing with you is the Ashton 31. So Ashton works with Friends of the Earth and have produced a fantastic tool which details the various actions that local authorities can take. It's not exhaustive. Certainly, Gina in the Northwest has suggested some things that could be added to it, but it does identify some key things, like, for example, workplace parking levies to reduce the use of cars in towns, and all sorts of things. But the clever thing it does is it gives you an estimated carbon saving, it gives you an estimated cost or financial saving, because often we are looking in the medium to long term at these things actually being cheaper to do as well. I think the point that somebody made over lunch, that a lot of this stuff is actually about saving money, and it does all that based on a hypothetical population of 100,000. So if you're, my Shrewsbury is 70,000, so I can scale it down slightly and get an idea of what that would look like for Shrewsbury. So it's a really clever tool in that way. So it's well worth having. Hopefully you've all got a copy of that. It is just a big spreadsheet. Sent it out a couple of times. Happy to put the link in again. So this is now just a quick recap on some of the story from the Centre for Alternative Technology, whose modelling for carbon zero is good, although some will argue not the best, but nevertheless it's the one I've been working with up until very recently. So what they're saying is that, just very quickly, so in terms of energy use, we need to, energy demand, in order to get to zero carbon, we need to reduce energy demand by 60%. And largely that's coming out of the transport sector, as you can see, the blue, and out of buildings and especially space heating. So the big story around continued use of gas central heating and the planning issues that are to do with that and retrofitting is huge, because that's that big pink chunk that needs to be dealt with. And then you've got appliances, which actually, appliances are already relatively efficient. So as you can see, the savings that is available there are not huge. And then you've got savings in industry, which I'm not going to talk about. Then we've got the second half of the picture, if you like, which is about the actual supply. And again, this is as councillors, we have some role in this in terms of local plans and neighbourhood plans, perhaps looking at opportunities for renewable energy, and also in terms of supporting this sector locally, whether it's straightforward commercial or through the use of community or co-op based renewable energy providers. And as you can see, the big story here is that we have to get away from the use of coal and oil and natural gas, which was huge part of the mix in 2017 down to one where they have disappeared, because that's what we mean by zero carbon. And so we are reliant more or less on wind power as the primary source. Again, the balance of all this, I'm sure there are people in the room who will argue with the balance that CAP come up with, and lots of people will, but I don't think that's something for us for today. But it's just by way of instruction. Then this one I think is a really useful one, because many of our councillors are in largely rural areas. It's worth having a handle on this, even though we know councils' ability to determine what farmers do is limited, but nevertheless we need to be part of the picture. And this one, the top story, is about the land use today, whereas you can see from the pink, enormous amounts of land are dedicated to grassland for livestock, which is a remarkably inefficient way of producing food. Whatever your moral take on animals is, the point here is about carbon use and efficient land use. But if you move to a situation where the amount of land that is being used to feed animals is massively reduced, then you can start dedicating land to carbon capture and to the production of renewable fuels. And we know, for example, that part of the story is not just the production of fuel and energy, but also wood for building, that actually capturing carbon in wood and then using that for buildings is actually a very useful way of developing some plans for buildings. Okay, that's it in terms of the big picture. So the next bit is really for us to have a think. To have a think about who your allies are. And as I say, really interesting to hear that discussion. I was interested in what Nicola was saying about all the various people that she was referring to that she's worked with. And I think I think it'd be a useful exercise now, and I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to do this in a second, to list your allies, whether or, and it might be people you think, I should have talked to that person by now, but I haven't had a chance to, or whatever. And I think that what's really interesting is that even from that lunchtime discussion, and I've heard this so many times from other people, that our allies are sometimes really surprising, that they are sometimes Tory councillors, for example. And I'll give you the one story from Warwick, which is just amazing. So as you may have heard, Warwick District Council is planning to do a local ballot on an extra bit on the local council tax to fund climate action. And that proposal came from the Tory leader of that council. Now, that's a situation where we have a very strong Green group, but they are in opposition. I've been told they have 2 or 3 very green-minded Tories who are up for this sort of thing. And between you and me and the gatepost, the leader of that sort of Tory Green group ended up on a training session from the LGA with Emily O'Brien, who's our leading on climate issues in Lewis Council, where we're actually in the administration, and they have the occasional conversation. So so it's just really interesting the way that we are influencing things, whether or not it's obvious. So you've got, from that extreme, you've got Tories, then you've got officers, and I think one of the key messages that came out of the survey that I did, hopefully you saw the results a few weeks ago, is that just by there being a Green councillor, we make space for people. And that, as I think Robert was saying, that you've got in your lunchtime discussion, Tory councillors who want us to say this stuff. And I think that's true of officers, it's true of the Green wing of the Labour Party, it's true of the Green wing of the Lib Dems, that we open up that space. That by up until perhaps a couple of years ago, and this isn't just because of us, it's just because of the IPCC report and all of those sorts of things, people simply were not talking about it in the way that they should have been. They are now, whether or not they're doing it, they are talking about it. And part of the story of that conversation now happening is because we're there and we're making that conversation happen. And sometimes all you've got to do is be in the room to make that conversation happen, because other people then have the confidence to say it. And so I think it's worth just recognizing that and patting ourselves on the back for that bit. And then thinking about who all your various allies are. And I just want to talk a little bit about my situation. So and really one of the reasons why I went for this job is because in Shropshire we declared a climate emergency towards the end of 2018. No, we didn't. My first motion was then, but then it was another one later in May 2019 that declared the emergency. And then by December, we had a strategy document. And actually, I ended up with a really interesting meeting in a room with people from XR, from Friends of the Earth, from the Wildlife Trust, from Sustainable Transport Shropshire. No Lib Dems at that stage, but probably could have had them there as well. And we just went through the document and sort of decided on what sort of response that we needed to put, because actually as a strategy document, it wasn't bad. It's just, that's where what we're often seeing is strategy documents that identify all the good things, and you get some of them really fancy, and they have all sorts of diagrams in there from Kate Raworth's book on donut economics and all sorts of stuff. What they don't have is the actions. They don't necessarily, the costed, both in financial terms and carbon terms, the actual actions. Anyway, the point being that your allies are really, really important to you, and also it's about making it a manageable job for us as councillors, especially if you're by yourself, because you need people who are going to be advising you and reading documents and coming up with suggestions for strategies and wanting to put in questions to council. So I'll shut up for a minute, and I want you to list. And you can put in names if you want, if you don't mind sharing them, or just organisations, so we get a feel for who you see as your local allies in terms of climate action. And again, don't enter them yet, just type them in. And whilst you're doing that, that gives me a chance to have a quick look at anything else that's gone into the chat. So 2 minutes just to list your allies.
So while you were doing that, Julian, would you like to, I've got questions ready collated here for you already. Would you like to take questions during the last 10 minutes of the session?
Yeah, let's do that, because I'm going to try and get through this slides quite quickly.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay, another 30 seconds just to type in any more allies you've got. And just to let you know, I have just posted the slides into the chat as well for you. Okay, yeah, send them now. See, Jamie's already done it. Oh, look, selected councillors from other parties. I like that. Selected councillors, absolutely. We need to know which ones are the ones who may, especially if you're by yourself, who might be prepared to put their neck on the line and second a motion. Community organisations of various sorts, Beds Climate Change Forum, Green Business Network, absolutely. CPRE, yeah, really useful when it comes to planning issues. They may well do quite a lot of the homework for you. XR, of course. Wildlife Trusts, yeah. Yeah. Council officers, good. I'm glad somebody's put in that, because, absolutely, I think there are council officers who've been gagging to do something about this stuff, and we help to make that space for them. Residents, of course, thinking more generally about residents on some of the issues, because, you have different allies on different issues. Okay, that's great. I'm going to move on because I want to get this going to discussion. Okay, so next steps. Now, this is the bit where I am really, really struggling, to be honest with you, because my job title is helping councillors go from climate emergency declarations to climate action plans. Wow, that's a big job. And obviously I can't do that for you. I can't make that happen. All I can do is provide you with ideas and strategies, and to try and gatekeep a little bit, because there is so much stuff out there that I'm trying to, by way of the briefings, to provide more targeted advice. But it keeps changing, and of course it's changed massively with COVID-19, and so the whole story of Build Back Better and Green Recovery and Green New Deal is all one story now, and so and and because of what's just happened over Black Lives Matter as well, that's brought right to the top of that whole agenda, questions of inequality. So all of this stuff is working as one, and in a way, my job is if I tried to be strict about the borders of my job, then I think that would be completely unreasonable. So I have to allow it to cover all that stuff. And then that comes to what Robert was saying at lunchtime. I'm not employed by the AGC, I'm employed by the party, but we can talk about perhaps that whole question of how we organise ourselves right at the end. So what are the next steps? Well, I did this just now, and it looks like a mess, and it deliberately looks like a mess because all of these things, interact with each other. So we know there's a story around sustainable transport, and you can see this. I love this diagram, that's why I've put it on the screen. Prioritising sustainable transport and getting the hierarchy right, with walking and wheeling, at the top, and immediately that brings in inequalities and issues with disability. Then cycling, then public transport, then taxis and shared transport, absolutely, then private cars. So having that always in that image around, and sharing it, share it with the other councillors if you want. I think it's a really useful image. Then we've got public health, which I think has shot up the agenda, obviously. And I'm working with Rosie Sexton from Solihull to try and produce something for us to really think, because it's a complicated world, all the various committees and the various nomenclature for all the various organisations that are to deal with public health and the NHS in your area, and which ones you can have representations on and stuff. It's a very complicated story, but there is a job of work to do there in terms of us talking about addressing the inequalities and also addressing the relationship, which is why there's all those overlaps, with the environment. So I think there's a particularly green message around public health, which also does have something to do with climate change. Then we've got green jobs and investment. Now, those of you who were on the last national call with Sian, she talked about, before you get into the detail, there's two big questions. Do we want to go back to what it was like before? The answer is no, just in case anybody was wondering. And is the future about austerity in order to recover, or is it about investment? Well, of course it's about investment, but it has to be the right sort of investment, and I think we need to be talking about green jobs. And then I just think it's worth remembering that green jobs is not just retrofitting and installing solar panels. Teaching is a green job. There is no reason for teaching to be carbon heavy. There's musicians, that's a potentially green job. So a lot of those sort of a lot of the industries and jobs and areas for work that we would like to promote, are not necessarily in green industries as such. Doesn't stop them from being green jobs. I just think it's worth having that in mind when you're thinking about sorts of investment that ought to be around, and as we're looking for build back better, if you like. And then all the planning, retrofitting, all those things that are obvious, if you like. Those are the things that we know we have to try and deal with, but not beat ourselves up if we can't deal with them all. I think it's so important that you prioritise, for your area, for your group, or if you're by yourself, just for you. Personally, for example, I'm a sole Green councillor in Shropshire. I simply don't go anywhere near the budget. Shropshire Council's budget is an enormous piece of work. It's a very big unitary authority. There's a Labour group, there's a Lib Dem group. They can get on with it, and I will, if I need to, I'll have a comment on what they're saying with regards to the Tory budget. It's massively Tory majority. But for me, I can't prioritise that. I need to prioritise other things. Okay, so that's the areas of work. But then the other thing I'm going to just bring up is about public participation. So I think for us, as the reason I pushed the thing about allies, and as I heard in your lunchtime discussion, the business of working with other people, in particular the community, but also pressure groups and other political parties, is so important. And we also know, Chris Boardman's done some really interesting stuff on this, where I heard a podcast with him recently where he basically said, if you haven't got people on board, just forget it. You have to get people on board if you're going to make these sort of drastic changes, and that's his attitude to the work he's doing in Manchester around cycling. So how do we do that? Well, these are just a few things to bring up. We've seen the beginnings of these citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries on climate change. Maybe we need to be talking about having them on a broader, green recovery agenda. Maybe this virtual town halls idea was something I talked about on Monday, which, maybe it's about having online public meetings at the moment, especially if you're in administration, or you can influence the administration. How about calling a public meeting to talk about what the council's done to help people through this crisis, what we now face, and to try and invite options from the public. And also, because in many of the councils where we have some influence, the local MP is a Tory, get the MP along and try and use it to put a bit of leverage on them as well. So, that was something that I think we can think about. Then we have to think really carefully about are we hearing all the voices in our community, especially minority voices? Because, part of the whole, if racism is largely sitting in this country as institutionalized racism, then we in institutions have a responsibility to look at our institutions, and we need help looking at our institutions by hearing the voices of people who may be being treated wrongly by those institutions. So there has to be a way of doing that, and I think that's part of the story as well. So I'm just highlighting all those things about involvement, and because we're not in the game of getting elected and then saying, okay, Rory, you can go home now, we'll get on with it. That's not our approach to politics. We need people involved every step of the way. Otherwise, we won't get changes that we want to see. So I'm going to stop there, and I've got one more slide, but I'm not going to do it now. I can work out how to. I'm stop sharing, and I think it's time for any questions quickly. But then we've still got not a load of time, not a lot of time, but for you, just people to make points and suggestions, and it'd be really good to hear what you're working on or think you need to be working on, or want help with. We've got the AGC conference coming up in 2 weeks, so obviously this conversation is keeping going. You've now got a WhatsApp group, I understand, in the East, which looks pretty lively. Oh, hang on, no, that was the East Midlands one that's on my phone. But I don't know if if you're talking to each other, then it's really, I think the culture for our councillors has really shifted, by the way, since January, and we are working collaboratively much more than we were. But this is a chance now just to shout out with any questions or any thoughts or priorities. Yeah.
So thank you very much, Julian. I'll start by giving you a couple of questions that have been submitted during the course of your talk. So one question we've had in, I think it was from Ben. So there's this one serious worry is the impact of COVID-19 on councils' finances more generally, at a time when many councils were already claiming to be cash-strapped. Many will find themselves genuinely cash-strapped. How do we argue for, on the terms of things like building back better, when the agenda is likely to be focused around cuts once again?
It's huge, isn't it? I mean, it's absolutely, the Greens in Power have done some work on this, and they've put together some very specific lobby points around things to do with the housing revenue account and some, just some of the detail. I need to pursue that a little bit to make sure we get it published, or again, is that my job? Is that Sally's? Anyway, that will, we've got some specific demands, but the big story is that one that, are we seriously going to go back to austerity? And I just think we need to just keep banging on about that, to make the point. And that's why I think the idea of trying to find a way of putting some leverage on your local Tory MP, if that's what you have, is really important at the moment. We know that the sort of, the red wall Tory MPs feel the pressure in terms of cuts. There is, the idea that the problem we face is that we're going to end up with something where there'll be possibly some, they're very talking about, shovel-ready big infrastructure stuff, but in the background, enormous cuts. And so we have to just keep highlighting that. I don't have an answer for it, but we have to be part of that story.
Thank you very much, Julian. I'm going to amalgamate two questions that we've had in as they cover similar topics. So one that's just come in was that we're hearing from our local Labour councillors that they are asking us to come up with environmental investment ideas, worked up proposals and costs. What worked up models do we have? But I also want to roll it in with a related question, which could be a suggestion in and of itself. Can councillors encourage the greening of local business by having a business rates reward or punishment policy that rewards or penalises those who are able to make their premises greener or fail to do so? I wonder if you have any thoughts on both of those in tandem.
Yeah, so this is the sort of detail where so I can't provide that sort of detail, but in a way, they're absolutely the right questions to ask. And if you've got Labour councillors in control asking you that, then it's cheeky actually, because that they need to work those proposals up with the officers. And I think it's perfectly legitimate to say, okay, what we've got here then is we've got people seriously wanting to think about this. What is our economic development team doing? So I'll just tell you the story in Shropshire. So in Shropshire, up until now, the economic development team, what they do is once a year, they go to the south of France, to Cannes, and they have a lovely time, and they try and, to use a crude word, prostitute themselves to the world of big business to try and attract companies in. Well, put a stop to that. Let's start using the economic development team to do some real work on the SMEs and look at the opportunities. So we know from our LEP, so there will be similar work in your area. We know from our local enterprise partnership that the potential for renewable energy in Shropshire is that it could produce up to 25% of the renewable energy needs of the whole of the West Midlands. Fantastic. Where's the work going on to actually start developing that? Where's, are we setting up a local investment bank? Bristol's got one. Some of the Southwest has got local investment banks. So those are the, so I think it's about throwing it back to saying, as a councillor, of course, there may be people out there, our allies, who have some shovel-ready schemes, but we as opposition councillors, what we need to say is, let's retool our economic development team exactly to do this sort of thing. Let's stop the business of just trying to attract, Nissan or whoever it might be, and let's look at developing local food security and resilience, developing, talking to our college about retrofit and getting the skills going in our colleges so that people come out of them with those skills to do the work in homes. So that's my attitude to that. Not that you can't carry the responsibility of having all those schemes at your fingertips, but you can carry the responsibility of saying, let's retool the council. Let's use our staff to start doing this instead of the rubbish, however you want to put it. Obviously, we all have to be polite. Instead of the stuff that they've been doing up until now, which has always risked just being beggar thy neighbour. We'll offer more incentives than the next door district just to get some wing of a multinational to come and invest in our area, and then they'll be gone again in a couple of years.
Thank you very much, Julian. We've had a lot of questions coming in, many on specific policy issues. So I wonder if Julian's answer might cover the answer to some of those, that it's not necessarily for you to devise on your own. I've saved the chat, so what I'll do is I'll refer these questions on to Julian following the session to see if he's able to answer any for you afterwards. Can't make any promises, of course.
No, that's really helpful because it helps me work out what I need to put in briefings going, over the next few weeks.
Fantastic. I think this would be a good time to open the floor out to open discussion. We've got about 10 minutes left of this this session left. I'll hand it back over to you, Julian.
Okay, fair enough. I had a couple more slides. I don't need to share them. One was really just a list of all the things we can possibly do as councillors. So if you're feeling a bit lost, or I've only been a councillor since 2019, and it's been 17, and it's been a real learning curve. But I think I've got to grips now with the various tools at our fingertips. But there is a slide with all that, but I won't share that now. I'd be more interested to see what people have got to say. But it's there for you, by the way. It just lists some of the various approaches just as prompts. So who wants to? Robert.
Well, it's just I wondered if anyone had any. As I said in the lunch session, our council, both our Suffolk County Council and District Council have declared climate emergencies and have produced carbon reduction plans for those councils. But we want to push them to involve the citizens in ideas for reducing emissions from the community as a whole, because that's where most of them are coming from after all. I don't know if anyone's had any success in getting citizens' assemblies set up, or if there are any examples that we could use. I know Oxford have done one. Oxford Council, because I've seen reports of it in the Guardian. But I don't know if anyone's got any ideas on that front.
Yeah, York have done something as well, and there is one council, I've got a feeling it's Kendal, who are planning an online citizens jury, and that's been prompted by Green councillors. So there are examples out there. So some people are using the hands in the participants, and some people are just waving. So Jamie put his hand up in the participants thing, so he's next, and yeah.
Thanks, Julian. I'm going to carry on the feedback. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you fine.
Okay, yeah, it seems to have stopped. There's a point about industry and working with businesses. What I found is that we can spend a lot of time trying to get the administration. We're an opposition group in Norwich. We can spend a lot of time trying to get the administration to try and talk to businesses or adopt investments that are going to be supporting the green economy, but a lot of the time it's actually much more effective to go directly to businesses. So I'm speaking to some of the businesses at the Hethel Innovation Centre, which is actually outside of Norwich but is near enough, about what potential there is for sort of innovative green technology, and they are then going to the LEP and to the county council, and then it's not, because it's not coming something from the party, the political party. It's a way of getting something moving. Because I feel like a lot of the time is spent at the moment, we're spending trying to get the administration or talking to other councillors, whereas actually it can be much more effective to go directly to businesses when looking at opportunities for green investment.
That's fascinating. I mean, I think that because that's a tough ask for many of us, but I think it's a really interesting thing, and it ties in with. I went to the launch of a Green New Deal document that Gina Dowding did in the Northwest, and what was really interesting about that launch was that it was packed full of people from local companies. And from energy suppliers and all sorts of stuff. So the work, I mean, she had, at the time, she had the luxury of being an MEP and having staff, and she was able to do some of that research. But I think you're right, Jamie, that that although I was going on about pushing it back to the economic development team, if we can find a way of beginning to pull together companies that have demands and putting that into something, as you just said, along with the LEP and stuff, and beginning to raise, these are the opportunities locally. That's really, really valuable work. I don't know how we organise that, but it's a huge piece of work.
Well, there should be in most places there will be sort of innovation centres or business incubation places, and they tend to be the places that are forward-looking. The Hethel place also has supports oil and gas servicing industry, but they also have a passive house development building company and people doing solar heating and heat pumps. So they are looking. They know that climate change is going to change their ways of working. So they're actually I found that they're quite keen to hear from people, hear from councillors as well.
So Jamie, we need you to tell us this story nationally somehow. So okay. And I know that I owe you a conversation about LEPs anyway. So we'll follow that up, because that sounds like fantastic.
Very early stages, yes, but
yeah, that's fine, isn't it? But if we can do that in other places as well, really good. Okay, anybody else?
Okay, if we can head to Ollie next, and then we'll be able to take potentially one more question afterwards, depending on time, and then we'll wrap up.
Great. Sorry, I've got children in the background, so hopefully it won't be too disruptive. I just wanted to say, so I actually work for a council. I work as an energy advisor for the council, and the council was using basically an investment program to invest in renewable energy projects. So I invested in a solar farm. We have a number of solar power purchase agreements in place where we've been putting solar panels on third parties' buildings, and they pay us money for the energy they use. And basically the council has realised that the thing that makes them money, they're trying all these other investment programs about buildings and all these other things. But the thing that actually makes them money in terms of the internal rate of return and the financial criteria they set are renewable energy projects. So with the new developments, the council is trying to build some new buildings. You know, they're looking to try and expand the renewable energy elements of those buildings, because that is the thing that's going to help to pay for the ongoing costs of the building, and to try and make it a more attractive proposition to the healthcare or whoever else they're trying to attract into the buildings. So for them, you know, the business case for borrowing means that actually the borrowing cheaply, as someone said in the chat, is then the income that can be generated will offset any borrowing costs and provide an income for the council. So the council started its work by using some of the money it put aside from social housing sales. You know, rather than leaving it in the bank getting, you know, X% as a return, they can get a lot more from the solar farm, and that was the thing that's helped to. You know, they've done their own solar panels on their own buildings, but now we've gone on to, we have a business model. We have, as long as we can demonstrate, we have an internal rate of return that is just above whatever the threshold is set by them at the time. We can make a project happen. We can make the case for money. So we've just done a ground source heat pump. We're just putting an air source heat pump in a community sports pavilion. We have an ongoing program of solar projects. It hasn't slowed in any way. So, but Ben mentioned Hethel. We're purchasing battery from Connected Energy based at Hethel Engineering, and we're now looking at how we can expand the solar generation on site to make sure we get the best benefit out of the battery. So I think the issue is that we need to make sure that we're looking at what is working around us. So that someone mentioned about Oxford. There's some great stuff going on there. There's loads of good examples out there. The Fit for the Future network run by the National Trust is a great resource as well, and a good place to find out more about what's being implemented cost effectively as well. And you know, I would strongly encourage us all to try and find a way of getting involved in financial discussions, because renewable energy is going to be what makes the council money, basically.
So Oliver, what's the leverage? What's the most important thing that people can do in other areas? So for example, is it about, because you mentioned the threshold, the returns threshold, is it about arguing that you've got to bring down your returns threshold and think more long term?
You don't have to bring it down. You don't, okay. You will make, what you need to do is we need to get into the discussions with them, and we need to get the evidence from all around the country. There's loads of good examples of it all around the country. We need to show them that actually you can invest in whatever you want to do, housing or buy a new business, but the thing that will make you more money is if you put solar panels on a range of businesses or on your own properties, or it's we don't need them to change. We just need them to look at these things not as green issues anymore, but as investment issues.
Okay, I mean, because that's something we need to think about, because I've heard other stories in terms of because of the loss of the feed-in tariff, in terms of the difficulties and long term. But if you've got a different story, then again, I'll dig out your email and we'll have a bit of an exchange, because there's some stuff there we need to share.
Yeah, there's some great stuff going on.
Oliver, there was a stream of people who are interested in you getting in touch with them. I'll save the chat following this call and forward you on that list. So you'll be able to supply more information via email if you have the time and inclination, of course.
But equally, Oliver, that's my job is to help gatekeep all that. So if you don't want to have to handle a whole bunch of emails on this issue, then people come to me and I'll liaise with Oliver.
Sure. I'll prepare something with links, and then that can be shared and we can work on it.
Fantastic.
I've got to go now. Sorry, I need to go and look after children, but I'm glad I tuned in.
Great.
No problem. Thanks for joining us, Oliver. It's a good timing as well, because we're going to need to wrap up this session. Is any last bit you want to say before I wrap up, Julian?
Only if people are coming to the AGC conference in a couple of weeks, if there's something you want in the set, because I've got a session, I don't know what I'm going to do with it yet, because I've been doing these regional sessions all over the place, and so obviously I need that session to be different. So if there's something you want made available to you in terms of either whether it's a specific bit of advice or if it's an issue you think we need to talk about, then just let me know.